Herzlich willkommen. Die gegenwärtige Situation in der Ukraine lässt praktisch niemanden kalt. Zu Recht. Gleichgültigkeit können und dürfen wir uns nicht leisten, wenn Menschlichkeit und Demokratie auf dem Spiel stehen. Doch was heißt es umgekehrt, sich zu engagieren? Krieg treibt einen Keil zwischen die Menschen. Wie lässt sich mit den inneren Wunden leben, die Diktaturen, Kriege und Katastrophen einer Gesellschaft schlagen? Das alles sind Fragen, die Elif Shafak seit vielen Jahren beschäftigen. Sie ist eine der bedeutendsten Schriftstellerinnen der Gegenwart. Ihre Bücher, die sie auf Türkisch und Englisch verfasst, sind mehrfach preisgekrönt und in mehr als 50 Sprachen übersetzt. Ganz herzlich willkommen, Elif Shafak.
Thank you for having me.
Ja, Frau Shafak, Sie haben zu Beginn des Ukraine-Krieges diesen Post in den sozialen Medien abgesetzt, ein Herz in den Farben der Flagge der Ukraine. Und dazu haben Sie ein Zitat gepostet von George Bernard Shaw, in dem er sagt, das Schlimmste, was wir einander antun können, ist nicht einander zu hassen, sondern gleichgültig zu bleiben. Wo begegnet Ihnen Gleichgültigkeit in diesen Tagen?
Unfortunately, we encounter a lot of indifference across the world. Partly it's understandable because we're living at a very difficult and challenging time in which every day it feels like something is happening. There's a lot of uncertainty. We've gone through the pandemic, we've gone through challenges, and people feel tired. There's an emotional fatigue. And sometimes I hear people saying, you know what, I don't follow the news anymore because it's too depressing. But I worry about that because if we do not follow what's happening, if we stop connecting, engaging, I worry that we're going to move faster into a world of apathy. Mm-hmm. And when sufficient number of people are disengaged, indifferent or numb, then a small number of bad people can cause a lot of damage. As citizens of the world, we have to remain connected.
Mm-hmm. Das ist ja auch ein Thema, was Sie in diesem Buch, in diesem kleinen Essay beschäftigt hat, hört einander zu. Da schreiben Sie auch, Teilnahmslosigkeit ist eigentlich eine der ganz großen Gefahren heute und zugleich werden wir müde, genau wie Sie es beschrieben haben, von den vielen Nachrichten. Und Sie sagen, eigentlich ist die Kunst, engagiert zu sein und trotzdem bei Verstand zu bleiben. Gelingt Ihnen das persönlich?
That is the challenge. I personally cannot claim that I am succeeding every day. Some days I fail, some days I think I do better. So it's not a linear road. But what inspires me, what encourages me, is to hear the stories of my fellow human beings. When you hear the stories of women, young people, minorities, sexual minorities from all across the world, stories of resilience, because despite all the bad news, there's so much strength in the human spirit if we can see ourselves as primarily members of the human race, not along nationalistic terms, not along religious fundamentalist terms, but members of the same human race. So that is something that I find very inspiring. And I think when we share our stories, when we make our voices heard, we will be more inspired. Mm-hmm. I honestly don't find it easy to speak in the public space. I'm an introvert by nature. It's easier for me to remain in a room full of books. But I also think our voices matter as women, as minorities. It matters that we hear each other and there's something empowering in that.
Mhm. Viele Menschen fragen sich ja, was es eigentlich heißt, sich zu engagieren und gerade jetzt Solidarität zu zeigen. Sie haben sehr schön gesagt, es geht eigentlich darum, sich sozusagen zur Gemeinschaft der Menschen zugehörig zu fühlen und nicht in Nationalismen zu verfallen. Mir fällt im Moment auf, dass ich so ein gewisses Unbehagen habe oder auch eine Frage, dass ich denke, viele Menschen gehen jetzt mit ukrainischen Flaggen auf die Straße. Man möchte Solidarität zeigen und dennoch ist es natürlich auch wieder eine Flagge. Und es gibt natürlich auf beiden Seiten ganz viele Betroffene, ganz vieles schreckliches Unheil. Also wie gelingt es, solidarisch zu sein, ohne sozusagen, ich sage jetzt einmal, den Frieden und das Verbindende nicht aus dem Blick zu verlieren?
I think what's happening right now is a huge injustice. Ukrainian people are being attacked, invaded. Their country, their land is being invaded. Civilians are being attacked. And it's important that the world shows its solidarity. Each and every one of us, there's something we can do. You know, I know some housewives who have been weaving, knitting, or bringing together food and clothes, and especially sanitary products for women. These are the things that we never think about because it sounds like, you know, like a tiny detail. It's not a tiny detail, it's important. So we have to ask ourselves, how can I help? And also, I think we need to raise our voices on social media, on the streets, because when we do that, our governments across the Western world also have to listen. So there is a power that comes from citizens, from global citizens. I believe in that, and we can inspire each other.
In Ihrem neuesten Buch, Das Flüstern der Feigenbäume, geht es auch um einen Krieg und es geht vor allem auch um die Wunden, die Kriege nicht nur den Menschen, sondern auch der Natur, und zwar über Generationen hinweg schlagen. Und zwar ist der Schauplatz unter anderem Zypern, wo ab den 1970er Jahren ein blutiger Bürgerkrieg getobt hat. Wir blicken ganz kurz zurück.
In den 60er und 70er Jahren kam es zu blutigen Unruhen zwischen den türkisch- und griechischstämmigen Zyprioten. Am 20. Juli 1974 schickte die Türkei Kampfflugzeuge nach Zypern, da sie nach einem Putsch der griechisch-zyprischen Nationalgarde eine Annexion der Insel durch Griechenland befürchtete. Die Türkei besetzte den Norden und eroberte 40% der Insel. 200.000 Menschen flohen, über 2.000 Personen galten als vermisst. Seither ist die Insel geteilt und Nikosia die letzte gespaltene Hauptstadt Europas. Die Grenze wird von UNO-Truppen überwacht.
Inwiefern betrifft Sie diese Geschichte persönlich? Haben Sie beispielsweise auch Verwandte auf der Insel?
You know, I grew up in a family in which Cyprus was always talked about. And I have distant relatives who were soldiers in the island. But that's not the reason why I'm interested. I'm a storyteller, I'm a novelist. And I'm interested in, of course, stories, but I'm interested also in silences, the things we cannot talk about easily, the wounds, you know. And this is a beautiful island. Cyprus is such a beautiful island with beautiful people, north and south. And I've been wanting to write about Cyprus for a very long time. But I couldn't dare, because it's not an easy story to tell. As you know, as we're speaking, there's a border there which is guarded, monitored by the United Nations troops, and it literally separates Christians from Muslims, Greek Cypriots from Turkish Cypriots. So it's drawn across ethnic and religious lines. And also it's important to understand that there are clashing memories. Depending on whom you talk to, they will remember the past differently. And the past is not a bygone affair. It's still very much alive. So the wounds in Cyprus are not closed. They're open. They're still bleeding. How do you even approach such a complicated subject without yourself, as a writer, falling into the trap of nationalism? Without yourself falling into the trap of tribalism? I was not able to find an angle, a door into the story. I've been thinking, reading, researching. Only when I found the voice of the fig tree, that gave me a bit more courage or an opening into the story. So it might sound odd, but I feel grateful to this fig tree because it allowed me to tell the story that I had in mind.
Also es geht ja tatsächlich um einen Feigenbaum, der miterzählt, der wirklich eine Stimme hat, der auch spricht im Buch, der auch Gefühle hat, der liebt. Wir sprechen über den Baum nachher gleich noch einmal. Noch einmal zurück zu diesem Schweigen, das entstehen kann. Es geht in diesem Buch um eine Liebesgeschichte zwischen Daphne und Kostas. Sie ist Türkin, er ist Grieche. Sie treffen sich vor dem Bürgerkrieg, sind ein Paar, werden durch den Bürgerkrieg getrennt, treffen sich dann in den Nullerjahren wieder, nehmen diese Liebesgeschichte wieder auf und gehen dann später nach London, wo die gemeinsame Tochter Ada zur Welt kommt. Und im Buch kommt auch Ada zu Wort. Sie ist da schon 16 Jahre alt, also es gibt unterschiedliche Zeitebenen. Und diesem Mädchen erzählt niemand die Geschichte der Eltern. Es ist ein totales Schweigen. Und Daphne, die Mutter, sagt sogar zu ihrem Mann, nie soll unsere Tochter diese Geschichte erfahren. Warum tut sie das?
Yeah. This is something that I have observed a lot in different countries, especially within immigrant families, but also any family that comes from a complicated background, any family that has experienced some kind of trauma or hardship or obstacle, what I have observed is there are generational differences in terms of memory. We always talk about family stories, but we also need to talk about family silences. So in these families, there are major silences that people don't talk about. But that doesn't mean that the silences do not affect people. They do. And with regards to generational differences, the older generation, the ones who have experienced the biggest hardships, they want to be able to talk about their traumas, but they don't know how, so they keep it inside. The second generation, especially within immigrant families, if there has been a displacement, the second generation doesn't want to talk about the past. Understandably, because they have to be forward-looking, future-oriented. They have to find their feet. They have to build a new life. So they want a tabula rasa, new beginning, you know, forward-looking. But it's the third generation, or sometimes the fourth, the youngest in these families, who are now asking the sharpest questions about identity, about their ancestors' journeys and memories. So to me, it's very interesting as a novelist to see these young people carrying old memories. And I wanted to focus on that.
Und interessanterweise die jüngste Generation, die hat in diesem Buch jetzt gar nicht zwingend erstmal eine Frage, sondern eine offene Wunde, könnte man sagen, ohne es wirklich zu realisieren. Also was passiert ist, dass diese Ada im Schulunterricht eines Tages aufsteht und schreit. Und dieser Schrei geht dann später viral. Und Sie haben eine sehr schöne Serie auf YouTube, die heißt Say Your Word. Und da haben Sie diesem Schrei auch kürzlich eine Folge gewidmet, wo Sie sagen, dieser Schrei steckt in ganz vielen Menschen, die eigentlich solche Geschichten mit sich mittragen.
That is true. There are two things for me here. The first is I think we're living in an age in which it's not easy to be young. And I feel like lots of young people, they carry a scream building up inside. They feel like screaming, you know. At a time of climate destruction, when our only home, planet Earth, is being destroyed, at a time of pandemics, inequalities, growing inequalities, uncertainty, anxiety, almost like an existential angst, many young people feel this scream building up inside. But if you come from a family of a complicated background, it's even more difficult because we're living in a world that doesn't allow us to be multiple. It doesn't allow us to be plural. It always puts us into boxes. So Ada is someone who has Turkish Cypriot mother, Greek Cypriot father, but she's British herself, she's European, but at the same time she's from somewhere else. All that plurality, she cannot bring that out. That's also important. And one more thing I want to add. I am interested in this concept of inherited pain. We always talk about how we inherit the color of our hair, the shape of our chin or cheeks from our ancestors or parents. But do we also inherit something as abstract as sorrow? Do we also inherit their traumas? I think we do.
Und es ist ja nicht nur so, dass man jetzt sich überlegt, was ist persönlich mit einem Kind, das Eltern hat, das einen Krieg erlebt hat. Wie hat dieses Kind dieses Trauma geerbt? Sondern was passiert mit Gesellschaften, die Traumata erben? Und das ist ein großes Anliegen, auch mit diesem Buch darüber zu erzählen, was passiert eigentlich mit Gesellschaften. Sie sprechen darüber, dass kollektive Amnesie eigentlich eine ganz große Gefahr ist in unserer Zeit. Das ist, glaube ich, das Thema, was Sie wahrscheinlich im Moment am meisten umtreibt.
I really appreciate this question. It's an issue that I care about a lot. Maybe because I come from a country that is very much shaped by amnesia. Turkey, as you know, is a country with a very long and rich history, but that doesn't mean we have a strong memory of the past. Actually, it's quite the opposite. We are a society of forgettings, collective amnesia. There's this void, you know. Our relationship with the past is full of ruptures. And those ruptures, that gap, is filled in by ultranationalistic and Islamist interpretations of the past that always talk about a glorious empire, you know, golden age. But as a writer, I know that the story of the empire changes depending on who is telling the story and who is not allowed to tell the story. So if you ask the women in the Ottoman Empire, what was life like for you? Maybe they will tell us a different story. Or if you ask minorities, persecuted minorities, they will tell a different story. So official history just erases all that pluralism. I think memory is important, not in order to get stuck in the past, but we have a responsibility to learn from the past. We have a responsibility to build a better future. If we cannot remember, we cannot repair. And what we cannot repair, we are bound to repeat again and again. So for me, memory is an important part of healing.
Was Sie sagen, erinnert mich sehr an ein Gespräch, was wir gerade kürzlich hier geführt haben mit Shalini Randeria, der Rektorin der Central European University, die auch betont hat, dass sehr viele Autokraten im Moment eben genau das tun, was Sie jetzt erzählt haben, nämlich die Geschichten quasi zu streamlinen, schlank zu halten, auf einen Mythos einzuschärfen, sodass eigentlich eine Geschichte dabei rauskommt, die diese ganze Pluralität nicht mehr toleriert. Das sehen wir in Ungarn, wir sehen es auch in Russland, wir sehen es aber auch in der Türkei. Gibt es ein konkretes Beispiel, was für Sie jetzt persönlich Ihnen besonders vor Augen ist oder auf dem Herzen liegt?
You know, I think about this concept, imperial nostalgia, especially those countries that were once upon a time empires. Today they are very susceptible to this imperial nostalgia, which is unfortunately stoked by demagogues, populist demagogues, which again always talk about a glorious empire, and they say we have to go back to those olden days. At the end of the day, of course, every nation state has its own official history, and in that regard all nations are similar. But there's one big difference. In a country with a proper functioning democracy, you can walk into a bookstore and you can find dozens of books that say, wait a second, what about my ancestors' stories? What about these people's stories? And the authors of those books are not imprisoned. They're not put on trial. They're not exiled. You know, in a country where there is no democracy, where authoritarianism has taken hold, the single narrative is imposed from above and it suppresses all the other interpretations of history or versions of history. And if I may quickly add this, as a feminist, I also know that most of the history we know is his story. For me, it's important to bring out the stories of women. That matters. So where is her story?
Das ist ja auch Ihre persönliche Geschichte so, dass Sie sagen, ganz viele Geschichten, Legenden, die Sie mit sich herumtragen, stammen von Ihrer Großmutter. Sie haben ein sehr bewegtes Leben bis anhin gelebt. Ihre Mutter, also Sie sind in Straßburg geboren, aber Ihre Mutter ist dann mit Ihnen in die Türkei später gegangen, nach der Trennung von Ihrem Vater. Sie hat da die Ausbildung fertig gemacht, das Studium beendet und größtenteils sind Sie bei Ihrer Großmutter da aufgewachsen in Ankara. Und diese Großmutter war eine Art Geistheilerin, sie war sehr spirituell und hat mit ganz vielen Geschichten gelebt. Ja. Ist das für Sie so ein Schatz, den Sie auch immer wieder bergen oder auch wieder öffnen und denken, diese Geschichte kann ich weiterhin für mich fruchtbar machen?
Ja. Indeed, and you know, I think people who have been raised by their grandmothers or who have been close to their grandmothers, we can sense each other. There's something specific about, you know, people who are very close to their grandmothers all across the world. I was raised by two women, my mother and my grandmother. I grew up without seeing my father. I grew up without seeing my half-brothers for a very long time. So it was a little bit unusual, my upbringing. And these two women raised me in a very matriarchal house, but in a very patriarchal society. And they were very different, actually. My mom is very westernized, you know, she's very modern and she's very rational. And eventually she became very well educated. When she went back to university, she continued with her education. But that was thanks to my grandmother, who supported her. So my grandmother was more traditional. She was more spiritual. Some people might say she was more irrational, maybe, you know. And she didn't have a proper education. Why? Just because she was born a girl, she had been denied a proper education. She had been taken out of her school. But she was someone who wholeheartedly believed in women's independence and education. So what stayed with me from my childhood primarily is solidarity among women. I'm a big believer in sisterhood. I think it means nothing if we have one successful woman or a few successful women there in different fields. It means nothing unless we empower each other, especially at difficult moments in our lives. Because my grandmother empowered my mother, that had an impact that went beyond, generations in a way. And yeah.
Das interessiert mich sehr, was Sie sagen. Und gerade wenn es um Sisterhood, um diese Schwesternschaft geht und wir über Feminismus sprechen, dann ist im Moment, habe ich den Eindruck, auch so ein bisschen eine Zeitenwende in Gang. Es gibt ja große Vorwürfe auch gegenüber feministischen Bewegungen, die sehr stark immer nur darauf gepocht haben, Quoten zu vollführen, die sogenannte gläserne Decke zu durchbrechen, zu schauen, dass Frauen auch Karrieren machen können, was alles wichtig ist, aber vielleicht zu wenig in den Blick genommen haben, wie die globale Situation ist für die Frauen. Es gibt dieses bekannte Buch Feminism for the 99% von Nancy Fraser unter anderem, die gesagt haben, wir müssen im Blick halten, was heißt es für die Frauen auf dem Land, was heißt es für Frauen in Entwicklungsländern, wie können wir diese Frauen stärken. Ja. Ist das auch für Sie so, dass Sie manchmal denken, der Feminismus ist vielleicht in unseren westlichen Ländern zu einseitig?
I think as feminists we can be self-critical and also point out what is missing, how do we make it better. It's important. There are some important racial, class, regional inequalities within feminist movements that we should be very honest and open about so that we can do it better. And at the same time, we will learn from each other. If I may share an anecdote with you, I remember when I used to live in Istanbul, an American scholar with good intentions, but she was telling me that it was very understandable for me to be a feminist because after all I was Turkish and I lived in Turkey and this was a country of patriarchy, so of course I had to be a feminist. But the way she said it, it sounded as if she didn't have to be a feminist. Yeah. She didn't have to worry about women's rights, minority rights, LGBTQ plus rights, or democracy, or freedom of speech, because she lived in America, and America was beyond these concerns. And I think what happened after 2016, especially with Brexit, with Trump, and all the rise of populist nationalist movements, what happened was this dualistic way of seeing the world has been shattered to pieces. Now we know that there's no such thing as solid lands of the West and liquid lands of the East. Actually, we're all interconnected and we're all going through liquid times. And that means even in the developed Western world, we can lose women's rights, we can lose LGBTQ plus rights, we can lose democracy. So again, we have to become engaged citizens everywhere.
Das ist sehr interessant, was Sie sagen, weil tatsächlich, glaube ich, auch eben zum Beispiel der Blick nach Ungarn ja sehr deutlich macht, was gerade passiert und wie der liberale Rechtsstaat ausgehöhlt wird. Ich glaube, da kann man auch immer wieder erinnern an die großartigen Essays von Ivan Krastev, dem bulgarischen Politologen, der immer wieder betont, dass dieses liberale, rechtsstaatliche den Gewinn, den wir daraus ziehen, dass wir den immer wieder von Neuem verteidigen müssen und dass er eben nicht außerhalb des Westens nur bedroht ist, sondern innerhalb des Westens. Genau wie Sie sagen, dass es nicht diesen Clash sozusagen nur gibt.
Yeah, I do follow what's happening in Hungary closely because it's so familiar, having seen what has happened in Turkey, and of course from India to Brazil, all across the world, we have seen a rise in a certain kind of populism or populist nationalism which can tip over at any point into authoritarianism. But my point is, countries like Turkey, I think they show something very important to us. Let us not forget, Turkey has elections. Relatively speaking, regular, free elections, relatively, right? That's not enough to sustain a democracy. I respect the ballot box a lot, but we put too much emphasis on the ballot box. Whereas for a democracy to survive and thrive, in addition to the ballot box, you need other things, primarily rule of law. Nobody should be above the law. Checks and balances. Nobody, no party, no company, no tech company should be extremely powerful. You need independent academia, free media, diverse media. You need women's rights, human rights. Together with all those components, plus the ballot box, a democracy survives. Otherwise, what we have is only majoritarianism. Majoritarianism is not the same thing as democracy. And once majoritarianism settles, it crushes the rights of dissidents, minorities, and it quickly evolves into authoritarianism, which we are seeing all across the world, unfortunately.
Da Sie die Türkei erwähnen, lassen Sie uns vielleicht ganz kurz auch bei diesem Land bleiben. Tatsächlich ist die Demokratie ja schon lange unter Beschuss, auch in der Türkei. Es gibt die internationale Journalistenföderation, die jeweils eine Untersuchung anstellt. 2021 hat man 34 inhaftierte Journalisten gezählt in diesem Land. Nach dem Putschversuch 2017, Sie haben es schon erwähnt, wurden 330 Akademikerinnen entlassen in Ankara. Die Justiz verliert immer mehr die Unabhängigkeit. 5.000 von 12.000 Richtern und Staatsanwälten wurden entlassen und durch AKP-loyale Juristen ersetzt. Im Moment gibt es dazu aber auch noch eine massive Geldentwertung. Mich interessiert, wie geht es denn den Türkinnen und Türken vor Ort?
Yeah, I mean, Turkey is a beautiful country. You know, there are so many people in Turkey who want a proper democracy, but maybe we don't hear their voices. So I do not identify the government and the people. I think the people are ahead of their governments, but we have a government in Turkey that has been in power for over 19 years now. And the longer they stayed in power, the more inward-looking, the more nationalistic, the more religious, the more authoritarian they became. I think the old maxim is true, you know, power does corrupt, and absolute power does corrupt, absolutely. This much power for such a long time is not healthy. And I also think when countries go backwards, like it happened in Turkey, when they tumble into ultranationalism, religious fundamentalism, or populist authoritarianism, women need to be more worried, because the first rights that will be taken away are women's rights and minority rights. So in a way, women have to be bigger defenders of democracy. As you pointed out, so many journalists, academics, cartoonists have been, in a way, accused. You know, humor has become a dangerous thing under authoritarianism. So we need freedom of speech. We, Turkish people, deserve a proper democracy. But I just want to say there are many people in Turkey, especially the young people, especially minorities, especially women, who are very resilient and they do defend democracy.
Mich interessiert gerade mit Ihnen darüber zu sprechen, die Sie so unterschiedliche Welten kennen und an so verschiedenen Orten auch gelebt haben. Zurzeit leben Sie in erster Linie in London. Sie zu fragen, was können wir denn eigentlich tun, um von außen Rechtsstaatlichkeit und Demokratie zu befördern? Weil im Grunde genommen muss uns das ja alle etwas angehen. Zum einen, weil diese Menschen uns etwas angehen, weil wir alle Menschen sind, aber zum anderen auch, weil wir jetzt gerade sehen mit diesem Krieg in der Ukraine, wie brüchig der Frieden auch ist und was in Ungarn passiert, was in Polen passiert, was in der Türkei passiert, das ist auch wichtig für uns. Also wie sehen Sie sozusagen die Mittel, die wir in der Hand haben, um diese Rechtsstaatlichkeit zu bewahren, vielleicht von außen?
Indeed. I think democracy is much more fragile. It's a much more delicate ecosystem of checks and balances than we recognized. We cannot take it for granted. We need to nurture it. You know, it's like a garden. One thing that we didn't get a chance to talk about, but I think it's very relevant, is the notion of identity. How do we describe ourselves? Am I only a citizen of my country? Am I only, you know, a resident of the region where I live? Or am I many other things at the same time? I want to think of identity not as a monolithic, static, solid thing, but as fluid, as more water-like, like ripples in water, in concentric circles. It is very normal and beautiful for people to love the land of their ancestors, to have a strong sense of belonging, but at the same time, we're all citizens of humanity, citizens of the world. So if we can broaden our definition of identity rather than narrow it down, then we will feel more connected. How can we help each other? First of all, to be open to conversation, dialogue. This is a crucial moment for global solidarity and global sisterhood. Let us be very critical of authoritarian regimes, populist demagogues, but as we are doing this, let us not cannot isolate the people. I think it's important that writers in Switzerland give their support to writers in Syria, for instance, or LGBTQ plus minorities in England, let's say, support LGBTQ plus minorities in Turkey, and so on. Or feminists in one country extend their solidarity to women in other regions. So if we can build these threads of solidarity, that will be a better world to live in. Otherwise, the moment we isolate entire regions, the only people who benefit from that are the populist authoritarian people, are the isolationists themselves.
Und da glauben Sie immer wieder ja auch an die Kraft der Kunst, an die Kraft der Literatur. Darüber sprechen wir gleich, aber vielleicht noch, wenn wir bei dieser Solidarität bleiben. In Ihren Posts haben Sie jetzt auch mehrere Male Musik gepostet aus der Ukraine, beispielsweise eine Band, sie heißt Ginger aus der Ukraine. Und es ist Musik, die Sie selber sehr berührt. Wir hören ganz kurz rein. I want a neighbor, not a hater, singt die Sängerin hier. Ja. Das ist eigentlich brandaktuell.
It is very current. This is a Ukrainian band. I think they're wonderful, they're amazing, especially the vocalist. At the same time, of course, especially now, they're going through such a horrible tragedy, humanitarian crisis. They're based in Kyiv, if I'm not mistaken. Their families are there. They have been posting, sharing their messages on social media. And their fans have been sending them messages of solidarity. So I have been following the news about them.
Sie haben gerade gesagt, es ist großartige Musik. Das teilt vielleicht nicht jeder, weil nicht jeder Heavy-Metal-Musik mag. Und das ist etwas, was immer überrascht, wenn man ihnen zuhört mit ihrer sehr feinen Stimme, ihren, wie soll ich sagen, sehr ziselierten, feinen Gedanken. Denkt man vielleicht nicht unbedingt, dass Sie ein großer Fan sind von Heavy-Metal-Musik und sogar Ihre Bücher, glaube ich, mit Heavy-Metal-Musik schreiben.
Yes, people sometimes are surprised because maybe they don't expect a middle-aged Turkish woman, writer like me who talks about empathy a lot, connections a lot, to listen to heavy metal. But this is the kind of music that I have been a fan of ever since my early youth. And over time it evolved. I particularly like subgenres of heavy metal, like more Scandinavian, Viking metal, a bit more gothic. Sometimes I like metalcore, industrial metal. So these subgenres, there are all these different bands from all around the world that I follow. I don't like silence when I'm writing, so I usually have my headphones on, because otherwise my children get very upset at me. And I like to listen to the same song on a loop, maybe 70 times, maybe 80 times, and that takes me from the place I'm in. Then I can concentrate better.
Ein bisschen wie ein Mantra fast schon.
Yeah, exactly, like a mantra, circles within circles.
Sehr interessant. Gehen wir zurück zu diesem Buch und zur Vielstimmigkeit. Ja. Vielstimmigkeit ist auch ein Stichwort, glaube ich, das Sie schon ganz lange begleitet und in vielen Büchern eine Rolle spielt. Und hier, Sie haben es schon gesagt, spielt auch ein Baum eine Rolle. Ein Baum, der mitsprechen darf. Nun, Bäume sprechen nicht wirklich. In diesem Buch tut er es. Aber dieses Gefühl, dass die Natur zu uns spricht, dass die Natur nicht stumm und starr ist, sondern ein sprechendes Gewebe, ein beseeltes Gewebe, ist eine Bewegung, eine Idee, die es in der Philosophie schon sehr lange gibt. Denken wir an Spinoza, der auch diese Idee des Panpsychismus vertreten hat. Und sie hat in der Philosophie gerade wieder sehr viel Zuspruch. Ist es für Sie auch so, dass wenn Sie in der Natur sind, dass Sie sich immer schon angesprochen gefühlt haben von den Pflanzen?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up Spinoza, who is important to me, in my own literary journey as well. As a thinker, I respect him. I am interested in also these other way of seeing nature, right, which we have lost today. I'll give you an example, if I may. For instance, Anatolia, long time ago, there were some nomadic tribes. They were called Tahtaji, which means the people of the wood or of the woods. And they, before, if they had to chop down a tree, cut down a tree, they would form a circle around the tree. They would perform a ritual with the tree and ask the tree's permission. Now, to us, to our modern ears, this sounds like nonsense, you know, such a weird thing to do. But these people, only people who wouldn't see themselves above the nature would do this. Whereas in our modern mindset, we tend to think that we are the center of the universe. We think we are superior to all other creatures, and we consume nature and we throw it away, we discard it, and we're destroying our own planet by doing so. Whereas from the point of view of a tree, everything is interconnected. From the point of view of human beings, bats, fruit bats, are just nuisance. But from a tree's perspective, fruit bats are so precious. Birds, fruit bats, insects, even the smallest creatures, they are all connected and they help a tree to pollinate, to spread its seeds. So all I'm trying to say is, if I follow a tree's perspective, I reach out interconnectivity. And that's something that I wanted to restore in this book.
Und das führt eigentlich auch über ins Thema Ökofeminismus, etwas, was Ihnen auch sehr wichtig ist, also quasi Ökologie und Feminismus zusammenzudenken. Als ich Ihnen zugehört habe, hat mich das gerade erinnert an die Philosophin Eva von Redeker, eine deutsche Philosophin, die sehr viel zu diesen Themen schreibt, die auch hier schon zu Gast war und die vom Kaputtbesitzen spricht. Also die sagt, unsere Art und Weise, Dinge zu besitzen, bestehen eigentlich immer darin, dass wir sie zerstören zugleich und eben nicht nachhaltig produzieren, nicht nachhaltig bewirtschaften und so weiter. Und das ist sozusagen ein feministischer Gedanke, den Sie auch weiterverfolgen möchten.
That is so true. That's very close to my heart. I think where we are right now in the world, we do not have the luxury of being single issue people. So we cannot only focus on a single issue. In other words, if we care about climate injustice, then it means you care about gender injustice. All the studies show that when you look at the people who have been displaced because of ecological destruction, most of them are women and children. Also, we do know that wherever there is a displacement, wherever people have to move, you know, in panic, they have to migrate, there is a huge increase in sexual violence. And again, you know, women suffer a lot. We do know the economic, you know, inequalities, racial inequalities. So my point is we have to connect the dots. If you care about climate, you should also care about racism. You should also care about xenophobia. And the thing that I like about ecofeminism is that it does connect the dots. It is more aware of the inequalities within our societies and wants to heal together. I think it's a time for us to reconnect, both with ourselves. Inside us, we have an inner garden. We need to take care of our inner garden. What do I mean by that? This is a moment of mental health crisis. So how do we preserve our own sanity? Balance is very important. We have to reconnect with ourselves. But secondly, we have to reconnect with nature, with trees. We have to understand our responsibility towards our earth. And thirdly, we have to reconnect with each other, with our fellow human beings.
Das erinnert mich an eine Sendung, die ich gesehen habe, auch aus dem Hause SRF, unserem Sender. Sie heißt Einstein und da ging es um den Atem und um eine wunderbare Geschichte, wie sozusagen in Japan das Leben in Gärten, in Wäldern, auch das Spazieren in Wäldern ganz wichtig ist für den Atem und wiederum für die Gesundheit. Also dieses Atmen in den Wäldern, auch das Waldbaden, das sind ja lauter solche Bemühungen, vielleicht auch in unserer sehr technokratischen Welt, wieder wirklich Bodenhaftung wortwörtlich zu gewinnen.
But that's so true. And when we take care of trees, when we spend time with trees, it changes us. I really think it makes us more humble. And we need that reconnection. Also, one of the things that we have learned from the pandemic is never to take granted. You know, we used to maybe belittle a walk in the park or just sitting under a tree. These were just, you know, things we never thought about. But then we realized you can't take that for granted. We also learned that maybe the most precious things in life are immaterial things. So this is the right time for us to ask ourselves, what kind of a life do I want? What kind of a life do I want to leave to my kids? What kind of a world do we want for humanity? Do we want more greed, more profit, constant rush that is never enough? Or do we want to focus on those things that are more immaterial, like love, like friendship, like sisterhood, like connection with nature? Because those are the things that will be more long-lasting and help us to get out of this loop of self-centered hubris that we have trapped ourselves into.
Das ist interessant, weil Sie beschreiben, die Vielstimmigkeit ist nicht nur notwendig, um zusammenleben zu können, sondern eigentlich auch notwendig für uns selbst, weil wir sonst uns eben gefangen fühlen in zu engen Gefäßen möglicherweise. Ja. Wenn wir über diese Vielstimmigkeit noch weiter sprechen, es ist ja völlig klar, Demokratie braucht Vielstimmigkeit und Demokratie muss Vielstimmigkeit aushalten können. Glauben Sie persönlich als Schriftstellerin, dass der Literatur in diesem Zusammenhang eine besondere Funktion zukommt?
I sincerely do, I think literature does something that is very unique to itself in the sense that it deals with truth in its own way. It does blend fact and fiction, but it does arrive at the truth through its own path. Literature can give more voice to the voiceless. Literature can bring the periphery to the center, make the invisible a little bit more visible, the unheard a little bit more heard. It can rehumanize people who have been dehumanized systematically. And I think, sometimes when I hear readers, it's usually male readers who do this, to be honest. They say to me, they come to festivals and they say, again with good intentions, they say, so much is happening in the world. I read about technology, politics, philosophy, history, but I don't read fiction. I don't have time for fiction. My wife reads fiction. My girlfriend reads fiction. And when I hear this, I feel sad, because I think inside fiction there is technology, there is philosophy, there is social psychology, there is history. There's everything inside fiction. But perhaps more importantly, there's emotional intelligence. And I don't know a single human being who doesn't need to cultivate their emotional intelligence and empathy. Otherwise, we become trapped in our own boxes. So there is something about literature that can contribute especially to this very sensitive, delicate moment in time. When I say this, I'm not claiming that writers should teach or preach. We are, all on the same journey together. I don't like the kind of literature that tries to preach. What I like is to ask questions, including difficult questions about, difficult issues, but always leave the answers to the reader, because every reader is going to come up with their own answers. So there's a diversity there.
Das macht für mich auch Ihre Bücher aus. Also in Ihren Büchern ist ja nie nur eine Figur im Zentrum, sondern es sind eigentlich immer verschiedene Figuren, die ihre Perspektiven einbringen. Und dieses Multiperspektivische durchzieht eigentlich schon jedes Schreiben, das Sie selber anstrengen. Mir fiel in der Vorbereitung noch eine Initiative ein, die mich selber irgendwie fasziniert hat, zum Teil auch irritiert, aber auch fasziniert, von 3 SchriftstellerInnen aus Deutschland, Simone Buchholz, Mitu Sanyal und Dimitri Kapitelmann. Die haben in Deutschland das Amt einer Parlamentspoetin oder eines Parlamentspoeten gefordert, und zwar analog zu Kanada. Und da gibt es ein solches Amt, da soll jeweils die Geschichte des Landes erzählt werden, aber auch das Geschehen im Parlament reflektiert werden, in der ganzen Ambivalenz. Und ich würde gerne mit Ihnen kurz ein Gedicht hören zu einem 2017 beschlossenen Gesetz zum Thema Transgender und Sprache. Es wird vorgelesen von einer Abgeordneten.
Now, you and me and he and she and they are pronouns defining humanity. But they're not, really not definitive. For how we lean determines how we live. Note that he is within she and that she includes he. Fluid is identity. Male is partly female because female carries male. To wit, gender's not a jail. So to be transgender is to be free, to be one's entire personality, a chosen body unfrozen from fear, liberated from custom, free to dare, to wear what fits, not what suits restrictions, and to be facts, not plausible fictions. Transgender's transgressive because it frees, masculine and feminine, as they please.
Ist der Versuch, ein Gesetz sozusagen literarisch zu verarbeiten und im Parlament dann auch eben vorzulesen. Was halten Sie von einer solchen Idee?
What literature does is, at least for a few hours, for a few days, it allows the reader to become someone else and to look at the world through someone else's perspective. I think that's a very good exercise for the mind and for the soul. You know, sometimes there are these debates whether a male writer can write about the female experience or vice versa. I think you can, yes, of course. If there's a genuine connection, if it comes from the heart, you know, not just planned, but from the heart, then why not? I believe in that freedom. I support that freedom. And if I may give you an example, maybe to follow up on the previous video, there is some kind of boxing within the world of publishing. For instance, we don't expect an Afghan woman writer to write sci-fi, science fiction, or experimental fiction. We want her to write about the problems of women in Afghanistan. But maybe she will, maybe she won't. Maybe in one book she will, maybe the next book will be about something completely different. So we cannot reduce non-Western authors or minority background authors to a certain function all the time. I think literature thrives on freedom of speech and freedom of imagination, and we need to nurture that.
Aber wenn ich Sie richtig verstehe, würden Sie sich auch dagegen äußern, dass es diesen Vorwurf gab der kulturellen Aneignung, dass gewisse eben Schriftstellerinnen und Schriftsteller gewisse Geschichten nicht erzählen dürfen, weil sie die nicht selber erlebt haben?
I know this is a very delicate subject, and I'm also a big believer in the need to open up the publishing world, because there are some glass walls and there isn't equal representation for especially writers coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. So I think we need to give more space to authors coming, you know, from unequal backgrounds. That's for sure. At the same time, while we are defending this, we should also defend the freedom of imagination for literature in general. At the end of the day, I think readers are the ones who will judge. You know, when you read a book, you will understand whether the author genuinely felt the story. But I cannot say to you, because you're not Turkish, you can never write about Turkey. I cannot say to you that because you're not Turkish, you can never have a novel that has Turkish characters. If you are connected genuinely, if you feel, you know, an emotional attachment, why not?
Wenn wir diese Idee der Literatur so hervorheben, die Kraft der Literatur für die Politik, dann muss man wahrscheinlich auch die Gegenseite betonen. Und gerade aus philosophischer Perspektive gab es immer auch die Gegenseite. Schon bei Platon ganz stark die Bevorzugung des Logos gegenüber dem Mythos, die Bevorzugung der Vernunft gegenüber eben dem Metaphysischen, dem Träumerischen, dem Erzählenden. Auch aus einer Angst der Verblendung heraus. Und gerade diese Angst müssen wir heute ja auch ernst nehmen. Sie haben selbst vorhin gesagt, wie oft Autokraten Geschichten umschreiben, einen Mythos zelebrieren und mit dem Mythos eine Politik machen, die eigentlich ganz viele Menschen an den Rändern wegdrängen. Also wie können wir einerseits die Kraft der Literatur preisen und auf der anderen Seite die Vernunft, das Argument und ich würde auch sagen die Kraft des Gesetzes hochhalten?
That's such a beautiful question. You know, we tend to belittle emotions a lot. Again, where I come from, I've heard in Turkey people say that women are emotional creatures, men are not, that's why men are stronger, which is nonsense. As human beings, we're all emotional creatures. And there are interesting studies that show what we remember through emotions. Like when you go to a conference, to a talk, if the talk is conveyed solely through facts, figures, numbers, statistics, in 2 days we have forgotten most of it already. But if the same talk is delivered via emotions, personal stories, you know, the speaker just putting out their emotions, then we remember. We remember how that talk made us feel for a very, very long time. Memory is very much linked to emotions.
Sie sagen hier ja auch in diesem Buch, Informationen rinnen uns wie Sand durch die Finger.
That is so true. And what breaks my heart is that, unfortunately, populist demagogues, they understand the power of emotions better than their liberal counterparts. As you said, with regards to information, I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I don't think they're the same thing. You know, we live in an age in which we are bombarded by information, which gives us the illusion that we know a little bit of everything. But actually, we know very little. So we forgot to say, I don't know. When was the last time we ever said, I don't know? You can ask me anything. If I don't know the answer, I can Google it. And in the next 5 minutes, I'll be able to say a few words about that subject. But in fact, I know nothing about the subject. So rather than putting so much emphasis on information, I want to focus on knowledge and wisdom. You know, there's too much information, but very little knowledge, even less wisdom today. How can we change that ratio?
Mhm. Wenn Sie sagen, dass uns Informationen wie Sand durch die Finger rieseln, dann denke ich auch ein bisschen daran, was Sie vorhin gesagt haben, dass uns Emotionen stärker im Gedächtnis bleiben, dass der Philosoph Odo Marquardt mal so einen schönen Begriff geprägt hat, nämlich den Abstraktionsschaden. Er hat gesagt, wenn wir in der Politik oder in der Gesellschaft, in unserem Zusammenleben immer aufs Prinzipielle, aufs Logische, aufs Argument konzentrieren, dann erleiden wir einen Abstraktionsschaden. Wir vergessen sozusagen, wie wir diese andere Form von Zugehörigkeit herstellen können, diesen Leim, den wir brauchen als Gesellschaft. Und das ist, glaube ich, genau der Kern dessen, worum es in diesen ganzen Diskussionen geht, weil ich mir natürlich auch Sorge mache, dass wie Sie es vorhin gesagt haben, die Autokraten die Mythologie besser beherrschen, aber natürlich auch manipulieren können.
That is so true. Autocrats manipulate memory in a way, you know, what is allowed, what people are allowed to remember and what they're expected to forget. And they do stoke emotions of fear, anxiety, frustration. We live in a complex moment, a complex age. What autocrats are saying, leave it to me, you know, I'll make things simple for you. I think we need to be very cautious, you know, if anyone promises us shortcuts, simple solutions, that person is lying. There are no shortcuts, there are no simple solutions. We have to be okay with about thinking in a much more nuanced way, with more pluralism and multiplicity. This is the age we're living in, and to me it feels healthier, you know, more reasonable in that sense, to understand the complexity of the era rather than saying, no, we'll make things simple for you, the way demagogues say.
Also wenn ich Sie richtig verstehe, es geht um Vielstimmigkeit und um Emotionen. Es geht nicht um diese sogenannten Monomythen, diese eine Geschichte, die alles erklärt und alles auf eine Stimme einschwört, sondern es geht darum, diese Vielstimmigkeit auszuhalten, auszubauen, zu bewahren auch. Und gerade da hat die Literatur eine wichtige Rolle. Es gibt in Ihrem Buch auch eine Diskussion eigentlich zwischen verschiedenen Figuren, aber vor allem auch zwischen Daphne und Kostas, den beiden Hauptfiguren, wo die Frage aufkommt, hat eigentlich der Schriftsteller auch die Möglichkeit, sich zurückzuziehen aus dem politischen Geschehen? Und Daphne sagt sehr klar, nein, der Schriftsteller, die Schriftstellerin dürfen nicht sagen, ich halte mich da draußen. Stimmt das?
I think it is true, you know, especially if you happen to be a storyteller from a wounded democracy or a broken democracy. You really don't have the luxury of saying, I don't want to talk about politics, don't ask me about politics, I only want to talk about my poetry, I only want to talk about my short stories or novels. You can't say that when so much is happening outside the window, and if that bothers you, you know, then you have to speak up and speak out. Also, again, as a feminist, I do know that politics is not only about what political parties are doing or politicians are saying. It's not what Boris Johnson said yesterday. Politics is bigger than that. Wherever there's power inequality, imbalance, there is politics. So in other words, the personal is also political, which means you might be writing about sexuality, you might be writing about gender, let's say violence, or a marriage, or a divorce. That's also political. So when described in such a way, I think novelists don't have the luxury of being apolitical. But that said, as we mentioned earlier, I don't want fiction that preaches or teaches. I want fiction that questions, asks questions.
Und genau eben das machen Sie ja. Und trotzdem wurden Sie ja auch sehr angegriffen in der Türkei. Das Buch Der Bastard von Istanbul wurde damals verbrannt. Sie wurden stark angegriffen. Sie können nicht mehr zurück nach Istanbul. Ist das immer noch eine Geschichte, die sehr, sehr schmerzhaft ist für Sie? Und hat Sie das auch nachhaltig geängstigt, dass Sie nicht mehr so frei schreiben wie früher?
You know, it did leave a mark on me. I wouldn't be telling you the truth if I said otherwise. Because when The Bastard of Istanbul came out, it was I was accused of insulting Turkishness. We have an article in our constitution which punishes people who insult Turkishness, even though nobody knows what exactly that means. And this article has been used against scholars, against historians, multiple times, against journalists, but never before against a work of fiction, which was very surreal, because the words of my Armenian fictional characters have been taken out of the text and used as evidence in the courtroom. And that madness went on for about a year, as a result of which my Turkish lawyer had to defend my fictional characters in the courtroom, you know. And in the end, we were all acquitted. But there were people on the streets, ultranationalists, spitting at my pictures, burning EU flags. And of course, that made me very sad also because I was pregnant at the time, so emotionally it was challenging. I wish I could tell you that since then we have made progress, but I'm afraid it's quite the opposite. It has been going backwards even more and more. In 2019, another book was investigated, this time for the crime of obscenity, because I do write about issues like gender violence or unfortunately, child brides and so forth. Why do I write about these subjects? Because these are happening. This is the reality of the country where I come from. It's happening. So to me, it's very tragic that instead of doing something about it, instead of changing the laws, instead of opening shelters for victims of violence, and instead of adopting Istanbul Convention, which is a progressive international treaty that Turkey abandoned, instead of doing all of these things, the fact that authorities are prosecuting fiction writers is very absurd.
Zum Schluss, Elif Shafak, Sie sagen im Buch, man verliebe sich nicht im Sommer 1974 auf Zypern. Wenn man in düsteren Zeiten lebt, dann hat man sich eigentlich nicht zu verlieben. Und trotzdem tut das dieses Paar genau. Es ist die Liebe, die dieses Paar trifft. Und Sie schreiben dann den schönen Satz, die Liebe ist ein kühnes Bekenntnis zur Hoffnung. Zum Schluss, zur Hoffnung worauf?
You know, sometimes I jokingly think I can't be very optimistic because I'm Turkish. You know, it's not in my DNA. Pessimism is easier for me. I think if you look at the map of Europe and if you trace the river Danube with your finger, as you go eastward, the level of optimism drops. But that said, I have a positive view on pessimism. I think it's okay for the mind to be a little bit pessimistic as long as we can keep our hearts hopeful. And that hope is going to come from our fellow human beings when we connect beyond borders, when we realize that we have so much in common, even though we grew up in completely different cultural contexts, and yet we have a language in common, we understand each other. So these bonds are very important. The things that go beyond borders, I want to focus on those things. And literature is like that too, it transcends borders.
Die Bande der Menschlichkeit wieder stärken. Vielen, vielen herzlichen Dank für dieses Gespräch.
Thank you, I'm so thankful.
Ja, wer weiterlesen mag, wir verlosen 4 Bücher von Elif Shafak. Teilnehmen an der Verlosung können Sie auf meinem Instagram-Account oder auf unserer Sendungsseite unter der Rubrik Mehr zur Sendung. Allen mit einem Herz für Literatur empfehle ich den neuen SRF-Podcast Literaturclub 2 mit Buch, der jeweils eine Neuerscheinung vorstellt und mit dem Zeitgeschehen ins Gespräch bringt. Erhältlich jeden 2. Freitag bei SRF und überall, wo es Podcasts gibt. Und jetzt gleich dreht sich alles um elektronische Musik, den Motor der Popkultur. Ihre Ursprünge liegen in winzigen Studios in Paris und Köln, wie der Film jetzt gleich zeigt. Lassen Sie sich vom Sound elektrisieren. Einen guten Sonntag. Bis bald.